Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne. Welcome to my channel and thank you very much for finding me in the crowded world of orchid videos on YouTube. If you're curious and new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any greenhouses or humidifiers or grow lights or equipment. Really just me and them struggling along inside or outside, or we don't play at all. So if that sounds like your kind of conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday, complete amateur, lots of mistakes, the odd success. And this might well help you today because plant lovers, yes, what do we have before us but a plethora of Miltonias. So this is my definitive how to care for Miltonias asterisk in my climate, which is quite specific. Anyway, you might find some things that are useful for you. So without further ado, let us dive into the world of Miltonias. First thing, where do they come from? Well, they are an orchid from South America, so from the east coast, sort of Brazil down to Uruguay and Argentina, along there. Not particularly high altitude. Asterisk, let's follow that point up in a minute. And one of the pluses and minuses is that they grew, past tense, in areas that were also very conducive to agriculture, so the areas around the coast, which means that they were some of the first orchids that Europeans noticed and named and grew, but also because that land was then used for agricultural purposes, a lot of the species became endangered quite quickly because the land was cleared. So the trees that they grew upon, they're an epiphyte, often were cleared and have disappeared. So they are one of the earliest groups from sort of the 1830s to be named by Europeans. But yeah, alas, that also means that they're not that common in the wild anymore. So that's Miltonias. It's one of those groups of orchids that has constant revision and exploration by botanists and scientists in terms of their DNA. Like who was your mother, who was your father, who are they connected to? Lots of confusion about, are they oncidiums? Are they this? Are they that? You know what? That's all well and good, no interest to me. Let's just say that there are a few recognized species of Miltonias still. If you're that interested, you can go and have a look at Kew Botanic Gardens, because there's lots of essays on the genetics of Miltonias and where they fit in the world, which I have to confess is of no interest to me. What is of interest to me is the fact that they're easy to grow in my conditions, they flower regularly, and they are sensational. Okay, so one other basic bit then, the name Miltonia. These were named after William Wentworth Fitzwilliam, 4th Earl Fitzwilliam, and his courtesy title was Viscount Milton, and one of his many properties was called Milton. So before he sort of acceded to the earldom, he was known as Viscount Milton, and it was at that period that these orchids were first collected and named in Brazil, and they were named after him because he was one of those wealthy early 19th century patrons of botany and exploration, and so had things named after him. We'll get to the fragrance in a minute. So that's the origin of the name Miltonia, and you might think, that sounds a little similar to, yes, Miltoniopsis, different type of orchid completely. And if you're curious, plant lovers, I in fact made a video called What is the difference between Miltonia and Miltoniopsis, and I'll link it here. I am here to tell you Miltonias are easier, I think, for me to grow anyway. Okay, so we've covered geography, genealogy, biology. What else do we need to know? Let's talk care. So first things first is that there isn't a huge variety in the flower. Now, obviously this looks very different to this, but this one, we'll get to this in a minute. This is a hybrid and it has amazing coloration. I then have purple ones, but I also have some species that haven't bloomed for me because whatever, who knows quite. But it's not a huge variety of flower color and form particularly. Now, if you look at the Miltoniopsis, again, not a huge variety of form, but the colors are off the dial in terms of solid spots, patches, all manner of things, stripes. But from my experience here in Australia, in terms of what we're able to get, Miltonias are sailing within a very narrow bandwidth. That's a mixed metaphor, but you know what I mean. Not a huge variety for me here. However, the ones that you can find are pretty sensational. I, for example, live for lilac, lavender, mauve. I love that shade, that sort of spectrum of color. Miltonia certainly fill that niche. And this one, look at that. Look at that. The color variations on that are amazing. So not a huge variety of colors and forms available for me here. Let me go back to that asterisk earlier on. So these orchids grow sort of along the coast of South America, not at particularly high altitudes. Now, generally, here in Melbourne, my winter nighttime minimums can get to, at the very lowest, sometimes 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, so the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. Often hover at about 5 degrees centigrade, which is kind of a little below the threshold for a lot of minimums that orchids, intermediate orchids, can take. However, despite the fact that Miltonias are not particularly high altitude, and a high altitude orchid is going to be able to withstand cooler winter nighttime minimums, because obviously the higher up the mountain you get, the cooler it gets at night, particularly in winter. Often it's damper too. And those high altitude plants seem to do really well for me here in Melbourne. So a lot of those plants from the Himalaya, so lots of Holcoglossum, Cymbidium, Sologeny, that sort of thing from up there, and also high altitude orchids from South America. So particularly things like Masdevallia, for example, do very well for me here. Miltonias, lower down, a bit more sort of dry tropical, but for some reason, they love my conditions here in Melbourne. And plant lovers, I only figured that out because I went to an orchid exhibition and sale in the Vietnamese community in the northeast of Melbourne. Fantastic group of bonsai and orchid collectors. And one of the growers had Miltonia Guanabara, this one here. And I think I may have had it at that point, but hadn't done very well with it. Anyway, she had this enormous shallow pan full of blooming Miltonia Guanabara, and I was just transfixed by it. It was so beautiful. And I said, oh, what greenhouse do you have? Does it take heat? No, she said. She lives further out than me. I'm sort of fairly inner city Melbourne. She lives further out, so it gets colder nighttime minimums, closer to 0 degrees centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit. But they are undercover, so protected from rain, so they are dry but cold, and they thrive. Now, you would never read that. And I thought, well, okay, if she's growing it and flowering it, then I'm going to do the same. Now, the hybrids do come from various different species, and the species can grow in different areas. Obviously, that's quite a big geographical swathe. So there will be variation, but I have experienced thus far that everything that I've got, including the species, thrives outside all year, undercover, but getting cool/cold winter nighttime minimums, not freezing, and obviously no frost. But there you go. So I only learned that by visiting a local grower. Now, you can get the same kind of information by joining an orchid club near you and finding out what people grow and how they grow it and how successful they are. So I grow these outside all year, undercover. Again, one of those things you wouldn't necessarily read about, because people do say that these are more of a warm intermediate grower and don't like cold temperatures that much. There you go, proved otherwise. The next thing is their growing habit. So this is an orchid that's very rhizomous. So I will come in and show you this one here. This is Miltonia Guanabara. And let me get the pot. It is quite large and heavy. So as you can see, there it is. It's in a beautiful bonsai dish. And I did make a film about potting this one up as a result of going to see that grow, actually, because she had hers growing in a very similar way. Shallow, but wide. Because, and I'll come in and show you, you can't really see at this angle, but I'll do a close-up. There you go. The rhizomes of these orchids do creep along the surface of the soil. They don't obviously have a very deep root structure, but they have a long one, if you know what I mean. Broad and narrow. So that's the tricky thing for me, is actually how to grow them. And because of my conditions, I don't really have many things in sort of Vanda baskets, those wooden teak baskets that you can get for orchids. I think Miltonias would do incredibly well in those slatted baskets where they can grow and tumble, and you can sort of pin back the rhizome so it grows on itself, and you'll get this enormous cluster of growth because they're very vigorous. So for me here, it's shallow panville, easy to divide really. You can just literally cut the rhizome and even leave it where it is to encourage different points of growth, or to separate the plant and create divisions. So that's one of the issues about growing them. It's a very runny sort of orchid, so it can be quite hard to contain in a pot in the way that you might want to grow an orchid in pot culture if you don't really have the outdoor space and you're growing them indoors. So I've got mine in a mix. This is just in a pre-bought orchid pot, which I've added a wire to so I can hang. And this one was a division and it hasn't really gone off yet because it's still relatively new to me. They are quite vigorous, so you will get a lot of vegetative growth, which is great because you'll also get a lot of blooms. So I'm just going to have to see what this one does. It's already starting to shoot off the bottom here with a new growth. So it's not going to be in this pot for very long, I don't think. And maybe when we move finally at the end of the year, I will move a lot of my Miltonias into Vander baskets because I will be able to hang them up outside under cover all year and just see what they do. So that's the potting. That's the tricky thing for the home grower. They can take a lot of space because of the pots they need. In terms of the medium, they're an epiphyte. All the species are epiphytes. And they like a free draining mix. There's a surprise. So you imagine it's living on the branches or in the nooks of trees. Water runs down when it rains or from mist. The plant takes up as much water as it can, and then all that's going to sort of dry out and evaporate quite quickly until it happens again. And these tend to grow in areas with relatively consistent rainfall as well. So that's something we'll get to in a minute. But essentially a loose free draining mix and whatever works for you in your area. And I have just got medium bark with a little bit of sphagnum, which I'll get to, and a little bit of perlite. And actually in this case, I've also got those little terracotta balls. And these were left over from something I got from Michael Coker, who I made a video with too, actually, one about deflasking and one about growing phragmipediums. And Michael uses these little terracotta balls in a mix with bark because he feels that the irregularity of the bark shape with irregularity of this shape causes lots of sort of vacant space, negative space, which is great for air movement, for water movement, and for the roots to sort of explore. So that's his trick. Anyway, essentially loose draining mix, the same that you would use for lots of orchids, for any sort of oncidium, for Miltoniopsis, in fact. Really, your basic orchid mix will do well for Miltonias. Which leads us, plant lovers, to water. We did mention that they were epiphytes. They are epiphytes. Now, a lot of orchids do like a drier season, some like a completely dry season, some like a dry season after they've flowered. I mean, it's quite complicated. I would say, as a basic rule of thumb, Miltonias do not like to dry out. So I water mine all year. Obviously in winter, I don't water them as much because the medium retains moisture and terracotta retains moisture. And when it's cooler, it doesn't evaporate as fast. So maybe once or twice a week, you could water these. In summer though, I do water them every day because they're all outside and it gets quite dry and hot here in Melbourne. So yeah, an orchid that doesn't like to dry out, which is an important thing. So do water it throughout the year, more when it's hot, less when it's cool, but still water in winter. And then food-wise, pretty similar to everything else. Feed it when it's active, which tends to be in the warmer periods of the year. So kind of from spring all the way through until autumn, depending when it kind of slows down a bit. I do a topical, slow-release, generic flowering plant fertilizer in spring. And then throughout the growing season, a bit of a liquid feed, maybe every 3 or 4 waterings, particularly in summer when I'm watering every day. Sometimes that is a liquid fertilizer and it can be a generic fertilizer for flowering plants or an orchid specific fertilizer. Or I use a tonic, which is not a fertilizer, but it's great sort of soil conditioner. And that can be a seaweed based solution, or it can be a worm juice from worm farms. Anything that I do use, though, I really dial down the dilution to about 1/8, 1/10. So it's kind of on the weak side. You don't want to overfeed things. So that's food. Light now. One of the many joys of my life, plant lovers, are books. And this one is a great one, Exotic Orchids in Australia by David L. Jones. And I found this in a secondhand bookshop. When was it published? By the looks of it, early 90s, I'd imagine. Or 1990, there you are. Anyway, out of print, but I got it in a secondhand shop. A lot of these books are just, you know, orchids need free draining mix. It can be pretty basic, but sometimes, well, generally there is something in most books that you will find useful for you, I think. And I guess that's the other caveat. I'm talking about how I grow these for me in my climate. And for you, depending where you are, it will be very different because they'll thrive and want different conditions if you're in a warmer area. So for example, if I was growing these in Sydney, further north, much different subtropical environment than I am in Melbourne, and I would grow these quite differently in Sydney. Anyway, I'm not in Sydney, I'm in Melbourne, and this book says Miltonia. Plants of true Miltonia species are yellowish green with a creeping rhizome, 2 leaves on each pseudobulb, and prominent auricles on the column, which is hollow in the front, whatever that means. But the point that is being made here is yellowish green, and obviously the creeping rhizome. Now, let's talk color of leaves. This plant here, and this one is Miltonia Goodale Moir Golden Wonder. So it's a hybrid. Look at that. Isn't it just fabulous though? And I think it's one of the most glamorous orchids. Can you describe an orchid as glamorous? Yes, you can. This is a glamorous plant, I feel, a glamorous flower. Now, most Miltonias actually have a fragrance. It's not very sunny today or warm, so they haven't really been triggered. But often, this one, particularly Guanabara, which is also a hybrid, smells of cilantro, coriander. This one has a vague fragrance. I think it's just not sun enough. Anyway, the point being though, if you look at these leaves, you see they are quite yellow and limey. Now often in an orchid you think, oh, that's not looking so good. Some orchids though, when they're in their peak sort of light conditions, will err on the limey yellow side. And this one I think is the perfect color and it's bloomed very well. It's a fairly new division for me. I didn't buy it that long ago. Maybe about 6 months ago. I repotted it when I bought it and it's flowered for me immediately. Now, it's autumn here in Australia, which is the time when they all tend to bloom for me. But that is the perfect color. So bright indirect light. And this one is certainly getting that. Now, one of the issues for me is plant lovers, you'll find this hard to believe, I have a lot of plants. And what that means, not all of them are orchids, it means that they're growing and thriving, which is wonderful. They cast more shade. So Miltonia Guanabara here in the wonderful bonsai dish, which has got only 1 spike for me this season. Now look at those leaves. They might look wonderful and healthy and green and juicy, and they are, but plant lovers, they are too green. They're not getting enough light. So the greener and darker your Miltonia leaves, the less light it's getting and the less likelihood you're going to get of really good blooms. However, in strong light, your leaves could get damaged, and it certainly doesn't want direct sunlight, but it wants bright indirect light. Now this one was getting the perfect light, but it's now kind of in shadows, and until I move, I can't really do much about it. So only 1 bloom for me this year. Now you can see the plant has gone gangbusters since I repotted it, and it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 growth points, each of which produced a new growth. Now each of those growths should have produced at least 1, but perhaps sometimes 2 spikes from the growth. So I should have about 5 or 6 blooms on this, spikes on this orchid. But I've only got 1, and I've got 1 on the bit of the plant that gets the most light. So there you go. QED, you won't get many blooms if you haven't got the right light. And that tends to be, I think, the reason why most orchids won't bloom is because they're not getting the right light. So unfortunately, Miltonia Guanabara is going to have to wait another year till I move and can give it the right conditions to thrive. But actually, look at that flower. I'm very grateful it did. Last flowering season, I think I had 3 blooms. Never mind. As long as the plant's still growing and healthy, it will get back into a flowering cycle when I can give it the right light. This one, because it's lighter and smaller, I'm able to hang up closer to the roof of my outdoor growing space. I'll link my grow space video here, just so you can have a look. But basically, it's a polycarbonate roof with a little bit of sort of shade protection, but it's quite bright and indirect. Also, it can get quite warm up there, so it benefits from that, but then it cools down a lot at night. So it's kind of perfect for Miltonias. So that's the light, quite a specific requirement for these babies. Given the size of the plant too, just adds to the difficulty of growing them, finding the right spot. And then quite recently, plant lovers, I bought this here. Now this one is Miltonia spectabilis variety moreliana. So it is a species. And where did I buy it? I bought it at the Orchid Species Society of Victoria annual sale, I think. Now, supposed to be a species, a variety thereof. If you look at that flower and you look at Guanabara, I mean, I know Guanabara is a little bigger, but not that different. Anyway, whatevs. Spectabilis, not this variety, but the species Spectabilis, is quite a different color. And it certainly is in the ancestry of this one. And I do have that, and it's just never flowered for me. The plant has never kind of thrived. I don't think I've given it the perfect conditions, but maybe one day. It's still alive, it's still growing, it's still happy, but never flowered. But what we can see on this growth here is we've got two flower spikes. The disappointing thing about this, I only literally bought it less than a month ago, and it was in spike, so I had nothing to do with these flowers, and you can see it's still in the plastic pot. Because what I discovered, you see the sort of creepy rhizomes there. When I actually got the plant home, I realized that the roots actually weren't in the medium at all. It was literally just sitting on top, and it was kind of loose, and I thought, oh, goodness me. So what I did was just sort of leave it where it was and just covered a little bit of the rhizome with some medium bark and a lot of sphagnum to keep the moisture. So we then backtracked to our second asterisk, which was sphagnum moss in the mix. Because these plants don't like to dry out, I do mix quite a bit of sphagnum into my basic orchid mix for this, just to try and retain a little moisture. So for this one, what I'm doing is trying to encourage the root growth to go into the material. So I'm not going to repot this probably for a year, just until those roots are really happy and thriving, and I'll know that it is doing well when it starts to send out new growth. And it kind of should be in the process of doing that now. So this may be set back a little bit, but anyway. But I do have flowers and I can see what they look like, and there you go. It is a little different actually to Guanabara actually. The shape of the lip here is quite different and a different color. Anyway, there you go. A lovely little plant. Very vague fragrance. I think I certainly do get great fragrance when it's a little sunnier and brighter. I think the fragrance is activated by that to try and attract the pollinators, who are also attracted by the sun. Is there anything else we need to talk about? Pests, pretty similar to everything else. You'll get mealybugs, you'll get scale insects, they're kind of the things. And there's no magic wand for any of those things. Just keep your eye on it. And often if it's not too bad, you can just pick them off. And I also just use rubbing alcohol with an old soft toothbrush if there isn't a crazy infestation. And even if there is a crazy infestation, I still use the same thing, and then I do spray them with an organic oil, which is for scale. But often with scale insects, you have actually got to kind of break the shell for that stuff to work. Anyway, I don't get a huge amount of either, but you can if you take your eye off the ball. So a great thing to do is when you're watering plants, pick them up, have a little look, because things can escape you, and suddenly, which has happened to me, you think, oh my God, it is covered in scale insects or mealybugs or some other beast that's nestled into it. And in fact, Guanabara here has had a little bit of a nibble. So hatchling caterpillars love flowers and new growth on orchids, unfortunately. And because mine are outside, they do get nibbled quite a bit. So there we are, plant lovers, Miltonia 101. So we've done light, we've done food, we've done water, we've done potting medium, we've done the tricky rhizome thing. A great orchid. So if you're in a climate like mine, go for it. So if you can grow cymbidiums easily, cotyledons easily outdoors, you'll be able to grow these outdoors as well. They just want cover and protection from the rain. Which sounds illogical, because although they want to be wet all year, they don't want to be wringing wet and cold at the same time. So you need to sort of modify that moisture in winter, keeping them moist without wet and easing off, particularly if you're going through a cold spell. But if you can grow those orchids that I mentioned, you'll be able to grow Miltonias. So stretch your repertoire, plant lovers, and have a go at Miltonias. Miltonia Goodale Golden Moir, absolutely beautiful. Look at those colors. It's such a great plant to see bobbing in the light outside, because it's just so golden and beautiful. And the lip is white, sort of moving into that beautiful mauve in the middle. The other two are basically purple. But I will say that the Spectabilis variety moreliana does have quite a beautiful lip with a sort of a lighty magenta purple and a deeper strip down the middle. So it is quite beautiful. Anyway, not a huge variety for me here in Australia available in terms of hybrid colours, but there are, and probably wherever you are, you might find that there are many more hybrid varieties that you can have a go at. And I think there are some that are sort of more on the burgundy red end of the spectrum, so that'd be great. Anyway, plant lovers, many thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed our Miltonia 101 extravaganza. I grow mine outdoors all year. You could certainly grow these indoors if you're in a cooler climate, and if you're in a more subtropical or tropical climate, of course you can grow anything. So what are you watching this for? If you have watched, many thanks, and I hope your orchids are treating you well, and wherever you are in the world, all is well, because it's not in lots of places, but never mind. Lucky us for being in safe, nurturing environments, and I hope I find you in yours next Friday for another epic adventure with orchids. What it will be, I don't know, but I look forward to seeing you then.